If you look at today's hi-fi market, you're going to be met by a plethora of companies who manufacture nearly everything in the hi-fi chain. When you look specifically at electronics, you're going to see companies like Name, Hagel, Past Labs, Audio Research, and Macintosh that produce preamps, amps, integrated units, DACs, streamers, and all combinations thereof. But in Pennsylvania, there's a company that makes one thing and one thing only, and that's preamps.
Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. If you enjoy our videos, you might also like our other work for audiophiles and music lovers: written equipment reviews, editor's choice ratings, product news, and music reviews. Get the latest each week with a free subscription to our email newsletters. A link is in the description.
Founded in 2012, Backert Labs are an American company that only produce tube preamps. Despite a crowded marketplace, this family operation has stood out with its unique approach to line stage design. I got to spend the last 2 months with the new Rhumba Extreme 1.4, an $8,500 analog line stage from the company that promises a lot in a small chassis. I'm Michael Johnson with The Absolute Sound, and join me today as we find out if this Roomba can really dance. Backert Labs is the brainchild of longtime hi-fi technician and tinkerer Bob Backert. Bob got his start in the business restoring and modding vintage tube equipment. One of his specialties was modding Conrad Johnson tube preamplifiers, and that's how his current business partner Andy Tebb discovered him. When Andy sent his preamp into Bob, he said he was astounded by the sonic improvements Bob was able to coax out of this much older vintage unit. Now, a dozen years later, Backert Labs is a small independent company run on the design side by Bob Backert and his son Gary, with his now business partner Andy running kind of the front of house. All of their preamps are manufactured and assembled in Pennsylvania. They produce 3 tube preamps and 1 tube phono preamp. Their preamps are all purist line stage designs, and they don't have any added modules or digital functionality. The unit I have here behind me in for review is the Rhumba Extreme 1.4. It's the middle child of their lineup. At $8,500 US, the Rhumba Extreme is the souped up version of their base Rhumba model, which is priced at $5,000. But it utilizes pretty much all of the circuit design of their top-of-the-line product, the Rhythm, which comes in at just under $13,000. As the name suggests, the Rhumba Extreme 1.4 is an evolution of the company's series of preamps that they've been making for the last 13 years. There are internal changes and external additions, but rather than cover the progress from unit to unit, these units I haven't reviewed, I'm just going to cover the Extreme 1.4 on its own. Before we get into the important internal design of this preamp, I wanted to briefly go over the exterior and interface. The Extreme 1.4 uses a vintage-style brushed aluminum faceplate. It is available in either silver or black. The design is minimal and fully analog. There are 3 toggle switches and 3 knobs on the front, all of which are completely mechanical. The toggle switches are a nice touch and feel much more substantial to use than the typical buttons, which provide the same features on most preamps. Those switches control muting, mono stereo, and power on-off. While most preamps have a mute switch, very few modern preamps think to include a mono switch. That's something that was far more common in the 20th century. Mono switches, which sum the 2 stereo channels to create a single signal sent through both left and right outputs, are incredibly useful for vinyl playback, but completely meaningless for digital mostly. With the rebirth of vinyl as a popular medium in hi-fi once again, I had hoped that manufacturers would follow suit, but the feature still remains a rarity. Unless you have a standalone mono cartridge, which requires, at the very least, swapping head shells when you're going between mono and stereo, you really do need to employ a mono switch in the signal path when playing early mono records to enjoy the best fidelity from those albums. In the past, when neither my integrated amplifier nor my phono pre had this feature, I was forced to employ a standalone dedicated switching box placed in between my phono stage and the rest of my system. Adding another link to the chain isn't ideal, but it was a solution that was born out of necessity. Now, especially because my reference tone arm lacks a detachable head shell, personally, I generally exclude preamps without a mono switch from consideration in my personal system. But the reality is that every listener has different needs, and how important a mono switch is to your system is going to depend a lot on your medium of choice and what music you want to listen to. However, given that tastes change almost as quickly as audiophiles gear, future-proofing your system is not a terrible idea. Fortunately, Backert have had the foresight to include this feature on their entire preamp product range. The front fascia cutouts that house these 3 switches are mirror finished, a feature exclusive to the Extreme as well as to the higher tier Rhythm. The power and mute switches are flanked by blue and red lights respectively to let you know when each switch is engaged, or in the case of the power light, when the unit is on and ready to go. The 3 knobs consist of a source select knob with 5 input selections, as well as an old school balance knob that has a catch on the center so that finding true zero doesn't have to involve eyeball guesswork. The balance knob might seem a bit archaic until you think about all the times such a knob can help you with system setup, troubleshooting, and all other manner of tweaks and experimentation. It's one of those things where you never know you want one until you actually need it. The center volume knob is highlighted by a bright LED pointer. This is one of the subtle exterior clues alongside the mirrored backing on the switches and shiny isoacoustics feet that your Rhumba 1.4 is the Extreme variant. This is because the Rhumba Extreme 1.4 doesn't actually say Extreme anywhere on the front face, and only a small sticker on the rear does the word Extreme actually appear. Only these slight visual differences give it away from the normal bass Rhumba model. The volume knob on this is mechanical, like all other knobs on the Extreme, and it is motorized to mate with the preamp remote, a very simple yet hefty device that only features 3 buttons: volume up, volume down, and mute. Do I wish there was a source selection function on the remote? Yeah, but I'm not going to lose sleep over it, and that would of course necessitate another motor in the front of the unit, something that is going to come with its own problems. The casework on the Extreme comes standard in black, but for an additional $300, Backert can have the body finished in a gloss blue or red. Some people like the simple and neutral. There's even young people who have somehow managed to trademark the term millennial gray. However, Andy asked me if I wanted my review unit to include the optional color finish, and I said, why not add a little color to my life and to your viewing experience? So I selected the gloss red. I must say, this will be up to your personal taste, but if you're purchasing a preamp at this kind of cost, why not make it look the part? The red finish it's gorgeous in person, and I don't think the camera really does it justice. I'm very happy I requested it. On the top, access to the 212 AU7 tubes is provided by an acrylic cover secured by magnets. While this might not be as easy and direct as some tube designs that feature the entire tube board on top of the unit, this is a huge improvement over many common designs that require the chassis top to be removed to swap your tubes. Backert provide the Rhumba Extreme with new old stock tubes, usually those that are 6953 types, which are 12AU7 compatible. They are very tight-lipped about which tubes they supply, as according to them, it changes frequently. My Extreme came with 2 different sets of 6953 tubes, which the company asked me not to reveal, along with a handy set of tube dampeners. But I will cover tube rolling and my experience with tube rolling on this unit later on. Over on the bottom, the Extreme has 2 notable features: a solid brass bottom plate, which is a trickle-down feature from their top-of-the-line Rhythm model, as well as isoacoustic Gaia isolation feet arranged in a tripod configuration. The Rhumba Extreme has 5 line stage inputs on the rear, 3 unbalanced RCA, and 2 balanced XLR. There are also a total of 4 preamp outputs, 2 unbalanced and 2 balanced. The balanced XLR connections are transformer coupled, meaning the Extreme does not feature a fully balanced circuit, but rather it uses transformers to convert its internal single-ended signal to a fully balanced one. There are, of course, designs out there that are fully balanced throughout the circuit. It's somewhat of a rarity in tube designs, though, and there are also designs which send unbalanced signal out through XLRs. Transformer coupling is a fairly decent compromise between the 2 topologies, and there are plenty of very expensive preamps that choose to employ this method of achieving a balanced signal. The inclusion of fully balanced inputs and outputs, I think, is important for Backert to achieve the goal that they clearly have in mind of their preamp being compatible with all kinds of systems. It's a fact that the vast majority of tube preamps on the market are single-ended only. And while those units often sound fantastic, they pair best with units that are also single-ended. However, it is not uncommon for equipment to sound better with a balanced connection. For instance, my reference power amplifier, the Hagel H30, does sound slightly better even doing all the volume matching through its balanced inputs rather than its single-ended. Again, I think flexibility is what Backert are going for here. Speaking of flexibility, there's a few other single-ended connections on the back of the preamp. Those are the home theater bypass and the record out. The home theater bypass only operates when the preamp is off. It allows you to run a home theater processor or preamp through the Rhumba Extreme to your power amp of choice using the interconnects you are already employing from the Extreme to your power amp. While many preamps offer home theater bypass, most of them out there on the market require the preamp to be on in order to use it. Backert Labs are somewhat unique in offering this feature without having to keep the unit powered on. Home cinema users should probably rejoice at this inclusion. The feature I was much more excited about, however, was the record out function, as that allows the user to hook up products requiring a fixed level output, such as a separate headphone amplifier or even an analog to digital converter. So I've mentioned this line stage is designed with a pair of 12 AU7 type tubes driving the gain stage. And there's many types of design philosophies within preamp conceptualization, from more tubes in the circuitry to fewer. It's safe to say that Backert's designs are on the more minimal, with no expensive rectifier tubes in the circuit. It's pretty much solid state except for the gain stage. The tube circuitry is auto-biased, and Backert claimed that they run these tubes with a relatively low voltage and current. The result is, and this is their claim, that they haven't yet encountered the tubes from their first batch of preamps, circa 2012, burning out yet. This makes this preamp an ideal candidate for tube rolling or simply for making a significant investment in your tube choice without the fear that the preamp is going to chew them up and spit them out. So go ahead and get those $500 Bugle Boys, because based on current owner experience, they're likely going to last you at least a decade and a half or so. When we look at what makes the Rhumba Extreme tick, a large focus of Backert Labs is their patented Green Force power supply, which on the Extreme is employed in a dual mono configuration. So what is Green Force? While the Green Force power supply does employ a custom-built toroidal transformer, it strays a bit from the traditional linear power supply design, and it's also not exactly a switching power supply. Instead, it chains together two small low-capacitance polypropylene capacitors for each channel, rather than relying on much larger electrolytic capacitors. Using smaller capacitors does two things. It allows for the capacitors to continuously transfer power from the transformer rather than discharge and recharge like a large battery. And also, in using higher quality polypropylene capacitors, it reduces the chances of capacitor degradation and the ensuing sound quality changes often associated with electrolytic caps over a long period of time. So then why is it called the Green Force? Well, this is because of the reduced long-term environmental waste Backert claim come from the materials choice and the fact that the unit shouldn't require recapping in its service life. Less waste, more green. What about the rest of the preamplifier circuit? Well, talking to Andy, Backert claimed that the majority of the internal circuitry on the Rhumba Extreme is the same as their flagship Rhythm preamplifier. So what's the difference between this Extreme and the much more expensive Rhythm? Well, according to them, primarily the chassis, as the Rhythm's all-aluminum chassis is apparently incredibly costly to manufacture. There's also a few differences in parts quality, but if you look at a map of the internal circuitry of the two units, you're not going to notice many differences between the Rhumba Extreme 1.4 and its older, more expensive brother. There are a few important specs that you should know when deciding on a line stage. Besides simply the connectivity, gain and output impedance determine what equipment would be a prudent pairing. The Extreme 1.4 employs 9 dB of gain throughout both output types. This figure is largely in the middle of the pack when talking about the variety of gain figures out there. Unless you have unusually high gain on your power amp, it should mate just fine with most power amplifiers out there. For me, paired with my reference Hagel H30 power amp, I stayed at between 10 and 11 o'clock for digital and 11 and 12 o'clock for analog. I appreciated that with the analog volume control, volume adjustment, whether by hand or by remote, was quick and easy and didn't require the endless spinning that I often have to resort to with modern digital volume knobs. As far as output impedance goes, this one is usually the problem child, as many tube amplifiers often have a high output impedance measurement, and that makes pairing them with low impedance solid state amplifiers kind of tricky. Backert are very proud of their output impedance number of 80 ohms, which is incredibly low for a tube design. Traditionally, in order to avoid rolling off your frequency extremes, you generally want the input impedance of your power amplifier to be at least 10 times the output impedance of your preamp. This means that according to the spec provided here, you'd be safe running a power amp with an input impedance of as low as 800 ohms. However, as some of you may know, output impedance is not linear, and that one spec doesn't always tell the whole measurement story. And many preamp manufacturers have been caught with their foot precariously close to their mouths when independent measurements brought to light wildly steep impedance numbers in harder to drive loads. I asked Andy if Backert Labs could provide me with some measurements of the Extreme's output impedance in the difficult to drive low frequencies. They were happy to oblige, and according to their test measurements from their lab, at even 20 Hertz, the output impedance of the Extreme only reaches 560 ohms, dropping to 320 ohms at 40 Hertz. So if you had any impedance matching fears, just know that those numbers are incredibly good numbers, and it's going to mark you safe with 99% of the power amps out there in the world, whether they be tube or solid state. For the entirety of the review period, I used the Backert Labs Rhumba Extreme 1.4 with my Hagel H30 power amplifier, driving a number of speakers, including my own Harbeth 30.2 XD, the recently reviewed Dynaudio Contour 20 Black Edition, and the Rido X2T tower loudspeakers that are on long-term loan to me from the Danish manufacturer. The Hagel has an output impedance of 20,000 ohms balanced and 10,000 ohms unbalanced. I use the balanced connection on both the Backert and the Hagel, connecting the two with a pair of Kimber Cable Hero XLR interconnects. Sources include my Pure Fidelity Horizon turntable fitted with a Hana Umami Red cartridge and fed through an Alnic H1202 phonostage, as well as my Inuo Zenith Mark III and Denethrips Pontus II DAC. Hi-Fi enthusiasts have lots of different philosophies surrounding preamplifiers and just how much fingerprint they should leave on the sound of your system. Many listeners believe a preamp should have no sound at all and live by the credo straight line plus gain, while others expect the sound of their preamplifier to kind of establish the core sound signature of the system. You will also encounter systems, usually digital, that employ no preamplifier at all, instead relying on the volume control of the source plugged directly into the amplifier. I'm not sure if I have a particular philosophy in this arena, but I wondered intently how a tube preamplifier like the Rhumba Extreme would affect the system and familiar equipment I was used to hearing. After my break-in and adjustment with the unit, I can't say the system underwent an upending change in terms of fundamental tonal characteristics. If you want a preamplifier that imposes a tonal signature over the rest of your equipment, I don't think this is the preamp for you. But that isn't to say that my system underwent no transformation at all. The most dramatic change I noticed was actually how the Extreme brought out and highlighted the individual characteristics of my components. For instance, two things my Hagel H30 is proficient at are instrumental separation and bass control. Throw that amplifier into any system and those are the key takeaways you're going to get from its influence. The Rhumba Extreme 1.4 gelled just fine with the amplifier characteristic, and in fact, it brought those elements out even further and with greater clarity and conviction. Take, for instance, a track like For All the Other Times off of Elvin Jones' 1971 Blue Note album, Genesis. In addition to the absolutely holographic and fully shaded bass of Gene Perla, we're treated on this tune to some otherworldly dueling sax solos that hang way off in the far left corner and far right corner of the soundstage. Often, listening to this track, those saxes usually just sound panned with a good helping of reverb. But the Extreme brought out a quality in them that made them seem like they were really taking up space, and that the space they were in was distant from me, the listener, and also cavernous. This is definitely an album with more kind of out there mixing compared to the traditional Rudy Van Gelder sessions, but it took a coaxing from the Rhumba Extreme to really put into words the type of soundstage and timbre I was hearing. Now, Backert named their preamp models the Rhumba and the Rhythm for a reason. They talk a lot about the concept of Pratt, that's pace, rhythm, and timing. Injecting the Extreme into my system definitely led me to take their manifesto seriously. On that Elvin Jones track I mentioned before, I could hear elements of Pratt that had me sit up and take notice. For instance, this tune has a relatively relaxed tempo, but despite that, the energy and feel coming out of the players does not and should not make this tune feel lethargic. The leading edge of the notes was coming across with this incredible snap and vigor, while it kept a very nice natural decay after the sharp transient hit. The contrast between the impact of the notes, particularly Elvin Jones' cymbals, and the shimmer and decay from those notes made the sound overwhelm my listening space with vitality. It also made the musical interactions between bandmates that much more zoned in and purposeful. Throwing on something with more raw power only accentuated my feelings about the groove that the Extreme could lay down. I streamed Chevelle's pounding rock tune An Evening with El Diablo on Qobuz. This is, without a doubt, one of the best sounding modern hard rock recordings I've ever heard, and it's very, very demanding in terms of bass, tone, and speed. No doubt at all, the Rido speakers I was using in this demo could definitely handle the low bass, but the track doesn't just require extension, it requires impact and forward motion. And in all those areas, the Backert was very impressive. In fact, not only did it deliver a vicious forward drive to the kick drum, but perhaps because of the influence of tubes in the gain stage, I heard a nice meat to the lower mid-range, and that gave the down-tuned guitars greater power in the chorus section. It made the guitars and the amp that the sound was coming out of feel more tangible and physical. Speaking of tubes, I want to talk a little bit about the sonic expectations tubes bring to the table and how the Rhumba Extreme fits into that mold, or maybe it doesn't fit into that mold. I could definitely hear the influence of tube sound on this preamp, but the influence was admittedly subtle. In many ways, a lot of the sounds I was hearing put this preamp in the realm of really excellent solid-state designs. The highs were nicely defined and detailed, the bass had a tight grip to it, and further, the unit imbued my system with energy, this type of rhythmic sure-footedness. But if you go back to what I just mentioned about the lower mids of the guitars on that one Chevelle track, the slightly richer presentation in a few pointed areas is where I think this preamp distinguishes itself. It is not the type of design that bleeds overall warmth across all areas of the frequency spectrum, but it's also not one of those tube designs that tries as hard as possible not to be a tube design. It doesn't try to sound stereotypically solid state. The bass, I think, highlights this as well. I recently got in the new double album of Pink Floyd's Live at Pompeii, and listening to this album on the Backert, I could really zone in on all the facets of how this unit deals with bass. In many ways, the bass I'm hearing, it's in line with the deep, powerful bass I'm used to hearing from my Hegel. It's finely textured and also has that kind of gut punch transient attack. But there's always this give and take between bass we describe as plump and juicy and bass we describe as tight and deep. The deep bass, it can feel leaner sometimes, but it hits harder when it counts. The plumper bass sound, it's going to sit a little bit higher in the perceived frequency spectrum, and it feels a little bit slower, but it can be more universally satisfying across varied music. Many tube units have what I would consider to be this plumper and rounder bass that perhaps maybe leaves out a bit of that deep extension. It's even present on some solid-state gear, and that's been my experience with Accuphase, for instance. The Backert, in my opinion, leads more towards extension and dynamic punch. And in that regard, I think that it has bass many people would praise in solid-state applications. But it still possesses just a little bit of that warmth in the mid-bass that those units tend to lack. The mid-range of this unit also gives off a bit of that valve magic with an open quality that flatters male vocals. For instance, in part one of Echoes, this open quality gave the band's vocals a throaty depth, and while still, it's highlighting the space between the vocals and the instrumentation. Nothing sounded squished together, it's all spread out nicely, and it's very solid it has this solid physical detail to it. In fact, physicality, the sense that musicians and their instruments are occupying solid, defined space in your listening room, is one of the strengths of the Rhumba Extreme sound, in my opinion. Now, I praised the inclusion of a mono switch on the Rhumba Extreme, so I have to say a few words about listening to mono records on this preamp. This unit really made me want to dig into my mono collection, and one of the gems that I pulled out was this 1954 RCA album of Arturo Toscanini conducting Schubert's unfinished 8th Symphony. This was actually a pre-hi-fi recording done in the spring of 1950 at NBC Studios in New York. There are, of course, some limitations to the sound here, including a somewhat cavernous timbre. But with the mono switch engaged, I was actually impressed with how focused the transient response was on this album. And while the decay was a bit of a mess thanks to the early recording techniques, the Backert brought out a nice immediacy to this recording. This came through on the starts of notes, but also on the microdynamics such as the swelling offbeat string passages in the first movement that kind of build and decay. Now, of course, it's an older recording. Some of the large dynamic passages kind of fell apart, but that wasn't the Backert's problem. And really, I was super impressed with how tangible and solid all the instruments on a recording this old and this archaic sounded through this system using the Backert and especially the mono switch. Now, jumping a decade and a half, I played the newer mono reissue of the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds. Well, actually, since Brian Wilson's unfortunate passing this month, in reality, I pulled out virtually all my Beach Boys mono records. But for the sake of this review, let's focus on this Analog Productions Pet Sounds reissue. Despite the fact that this was a modern mono reissue cut on modern mono equipment, I still kept the mono switch engaged. The openness of the mid-range on this preamp was a huge strength in unraveling the rich vocal harmonies of the band. On Wouldn't It Be Nice, I no longer heard the backing vocals as a blob, but rather as individual voices striving for a blend. Yes, it was blended, but you could still hear the individual members as part of a greater whole. The highs were also very finely balanced. Going into the song, You Still Believe in Me, there's a lot of high frequency information on this song, with bells, chimes, and all other manner of instruments that sits at the top of the frequency spectrum. On equipment with super soft highs, those instruments, they sound pleasant, but they sound distant and they lack in physicality. But then again, you get too much upper end emphasis and it's too etched, and yes, you hear the physicality in detail, but it dominates the track and it can be really fatigue inducing. I would say the Rhumba Extreme is balanced kind of right down the middle in its high frequency extension, drawing just enough detail and attention to these instruments, but it doesn't rub your nose in it. You'll notice I haven't talked about the bass yet. As Beach Boys fans are aware, Pet Sounds has a lot of bass, especially the mono cut, and it can sometimes get a bit out of hand. I've listened to this exact copy of this album on many a system, and sometimes the big powerful bass, such as on Don't Talk, it can sound boomy, and it can just take over the track, bleeding up into the mid-range and kind of stepping all over the beautiful vocals. But the bass here, it did not possess those negative characteristics. Oh, yeah, it was plenty powerful, rich, and tubby, but the notes were still very clearly defined, had texture, and made plenty of room for the other instrumental elements to play out. Then you take the walloping timpani intro on I'm Waiting for the Day, and it explodes out of the speaker with power and dynamics, and you can really hear the flap of the timpani head when the mallets are just wailing on it. But it's all tight and controlled. It never ruins the illusion. If I had to pick one element that stands out to me on this preamplifier, it's definitely the bass. It's so perfectly balanced between detailed, extended, and rich, but it also provides the underpinning that I think makes this unit excel in its sense of timing. I realize I didn't talk yet about tube rolling. As I mentioned before, Backert supplied me with 2 sets of new old stock 6953 tubes for this review to experience the changes tube rolling makes on this unit. Backert are constantly changing the NOS tubes they supply with these preamps, so I won't get too into the specifics on the individual tubes, but the preamp did respond positively to tube rolling, as one pair of these tubes seemed to emphasize mid-range refinement and detail, and then when I swapped in the other pair, I heard much more upper bass richness and kind of a vintage style punchy quality. The difference didn't turn the preamp into a new device, but it was enough of a change that I think tube rollers will be pleased. The fact that this preamp only requires 2 12 AU7 style tubes means that tube rolling is not going to be a financial burden. Throughout this whole review, I think I've highlighted aspects of how the Rhumba Extreme 1.4 complemented and enhanced the sound quality of my reference equipment. Its limitations are not many, mainly that it doesn't try to be anything other than a pure analog preamp. This is great for those who value separates in their audio chain, but less convenient for those that want fewer boxes. Still, this preamp is slender enough that it's going to fit on the middle shelf of most equipment racks, and it's not going to be a real estate hog. Another point I want to mention should hopefully be clear from the descriptions I used to talk about the sound quality with this preamp, that in most ways, it's a fairly neutral, balanced sound with just a bit of that tube richness that sets it apart. If you're looking for that full, sweet, euphoric tube experience, the kind where the sound stage just expands to fantastical heights and everything is bathed in a kind of warm glow, this just isn't that experience, which is okay. There are definitely products out there that can scratch that itch if that's what you're seeking. In many ways, though, that's what I love about the Rhumba Extreme. It's kind of this Goldilocks tube design. It has just enough euphoric touches to an otherwise well-defined and neutral sound that I think it's going to convert a lot of tube virgins to the Valve experience. At $8,500, the Rhumba Extreme 1.4, it's not entry-level by any means. But it not only did its job admirably, it paired very nicely with equipment costing double or more its price. Hooked up to the $19,000 Rido or to the $15,000 Hagel H30 amp, this preamp not only held its own, but it brought out and highlighted positive qualities of those pieces and helped them form a more coherent stereo system. Further, I think this preamp energized music in a presentation I would describe as crowd-pleasing, with excellent pace, rhythm, and timing that kind of underpinned all of the music that I played. I think the Rhumba Extreme 1.4 has proven that Backert Labs is an American hi-fi company to watch out for. And through my 2 months with this preamplifier, appreciated its build quality, functionality, and most importantly, its sound. If you're in the market for a pure analog line stage preamp, especially one in the very competitive 5 to 10K price bracket, this model should be at the top of your audition list. At least that's my perspective, and we would love to hear yours. Please leave a comment down below, and while you're at it, you can go ahead and hit those like and subscribe buttons so that more hi-fi reviews like this one show up right in your feed. I'm Michael Johnson with The Absolute Sound, and I'll see you all in the next review.